everybody, it's Fox and welcome back to my channel. And for this week's video, I am apparently gonna be just waving this around back and forth. This week's video, I'm gonna be showing you how I put together this Sylvie Sword. I keep wanting to call it a dagger. This is most definitely not a dagger. This is giant. Yeah, if you want to see how I put this together, then just keep on watching. The model that I'm using for this sword is from do3d.com. The only thing that I really didn't like about this model is that there is no place for internal support. Normally for something this long, I would like to put some kind of internal structure into it, like say a brass wire or a metal rod, just so I have a little bit more support in terms of, you know, not getting floppy and all that stuff. Printing this out was pretty simple. I just printed the hilt in one piece, and then for the blade, it was a little bit too tall for my Creality CR10S. So what I did was I went into Mesh Mixer and I just did a plain cut on the very top of the sword, kind of where all of the runes stop, so that it would be like an easy place to transition and I wouldn't need to do nearly as much fill work up there. So like I said, I just did a plain cut there, exported both of those models, and then printed them out on my printer. And about a day or so later, I had all of my pieces ready to work with. I decided to work on the hilt first because, well, I decided to print it out first, and it was the first one that was done off of the printer. So what I did was I took it off and I got all of those supports off of there using my plastic clippers. And once my plastic clippers weren't really getting anything else up, I then took out my secret weapon, which is my soldering iron, and just kind of lightly went over where all those spots of the ingrained supports were all over. I also took my soldering iron and with a really thin tip and went over some of the details on the hilt as well, just to kind of bring them out a little bit more and to also get a little bit of the support areas out of there that I completely forgot to take out. So I used my soldering iron for that as well. I then went out to my garage and using some 80 grit sandpaper did a little light pass over the entire piece. Now, in order to get rid of the layer lines that we get with these FDM prints, I am going to be using UV resin. And if you've been watching my channel for the past couple months, you know that I've been kind of in love with this method. It has really changed the game for me. It allows me to get my 3D print smooth really quick, and it's just something I've just been enjoying. It's a lot different than using Bondo. So if you are interested in that method, I will link a couple videos that go into it in more detail up above as well as down below and everywhere on the screen. I'm sure there will be pictures everywhere. The long and short of using UV resin in order to smooth our props is that we're just going to take some of that UV resin, pour it into a disposable cup, and then we're going to use a foam brush and basically paint a thin layer of the stuff all over our FDM print. Now, something that I've noticed over time is that whenever I'm using my foam brush, I use it for multiple layers. Sometimes the foam will start to kind of degrade and kind of get stuck on my piece. I don't typically worry about this too much because whenever it comes to sanding things, they get sanded off pretty easily. But I did want to ask you guys if you know of any kind of reusable tool that I could use to get this stuff onto my props, because I do feel kind of wasteful using all these foam brushes, and it would be nice to have something that doesn't get, you know, foam all over my piece. So if you know anything like that that might work, that would be great. Like, leave me a comment down below if you know something. I have tried using silicone brushes and it kind of works, but I still do have to be careful about, you know, making sure that I'm immediately washing them as soon as I'm done using them. And I also have to make sure that I'm wearing gloves whenever I'm washing them. So it's kind of a hassle. So if you know anything that could replace a foam brush and would be a little bit more reusable, that would be awesome. Now for the hilt, I did use 2 layers of UV resin, and that just basically equated to me painting on a layer of resin, curing it for 15 minutes, washing it with some alcohol, and then painting on another layer, curing for 15 minutes, washing with alcohol, and then it was time for me to go out to my garage and sand everything down. I started off by using 120 grit sandpaper and then moved up to 240, and once everything was looking how I wanted it to, I washed the piece off and then gave it a nice coat of filler primer. Once that filler primer was dry, I then went back out to my garage again and sanded it down with some 240 grit sandpaper and went up to 320 grit sandpaper. Once I was happy with how the piece was looking, I then sprayed on one last layer of filler primer, and then it was time to put on the base coat of Montana Gold Shock Black, my favorite. While that hilt is drying, I'm going to be switching gears and working on the blade part of the sword. Now the blade portion is actually going to be a little bit easier for us to sand just because it's a flat surface, and I ended up doing about 3 layers of resin on this blade. One thing we're going to have to be cognizant about whenever we're working on this blade is that there are a lot of details in there, and every time you do a pass of the UV resin, just make sure you go back over it with another foam brush, trying to get it out of all of the little rune details as well as the little swirly bits on the side, just so that we make sure that we don't lose them whenever we cure our resin later. Once all of those layers of resin were cured, I then took my blade out to my garage and sanded it down with 120 grit sandpaper on my mouse sander. I forgot to film this part, but for the top part of the sword and the bottom part, obviously there's going to be a seam there that we need to fill. So what I ended up doing was I glued it together with some Gorilla Glue and then did a couple layers of resin on top. There's obviously going to be some imperfections and divots here and there. So what I'm doing is I'm using Bondo to fill those pieces in, because yes, I still do use Bondo. I get asked that on occasion if I've like thrown it out. No, Bondo still has its place, and it really does help to fill in all those little cracks and little scratches on my piece. Even if you're very careful with how much resin you're putting into the details on this sword, you're gonna get filler primer in these details, you're gonna get Bondo in them. So in order to counteract that, I'm using those little hook tools that I got from Harbor Freight, and I'm just carving everything back out again. And it's tedious because I have to do this every time I put a new layer of filler primer on, but it's worth it in the end because now you can see all of these beautiful details in all of their glory. I then go ahead and give it another round of Bondo and filler primer just because I wasn't exactly happy with the smoothness that I was getting. But this is where I then took my sword and started to do some wet sanding. Wet sanding is exactly what it sounds like, and it isn't as intimidating as you might think it is. Now, to wet sand, you just need to make sure that you have sandpaper that is formulated for wet sanding, because not all sandpaper will work well whenever it is wet. Trust me, I have used stuff that degrades whenever it gets wet. So make sure whenever you go to the hardware store or wherever you pick up your sandpaper that it is specifically formulated for wet sanding. Now, whenever I wet sand, I prefer to be working under running water, but you can totally just get like a tub of water next to you and keep dipping your sandpaper in it. And all that you do is you get your piece wet and you just sand. That's really all that there is to it. And I used to be so intimidated by wet sanding, and I also didn't understand why people did it. The main reason that people do it is to get an even smoother finish to the piece than you could just dry sanding it. And once I was happy with that, I just took my blade and dried it off with a towel, and I went outside and I gave it another layer of filler primer. Once that last layer of filler primer was cured, I gave it one last pass of wet sanding with some 800 grit and then 1500 grit sandpaper, and then it was finally time for that sword blade to get its own coat of Montana Gold Shock Black. Something kind of funny happened with this sword, and for some reason I decided to put this sword blade outside in about 95 to 100 degree weather and paint it. And I don't know why I didn't think like, hey, this is literally plastic, it's going to melt. I was like, it'll be in the sun, it'll cure the paint faster, it'll be totally fine. Then we went and took our dog for a walk, and I came in and it was basically like floppy and wasn't flat anymore. And I couldn't believe that I did it. It was just such a stupid move on my part. I just took the piece inside and waited until the piece had completely cooled down, mostly because I didn't want to disturb the paint that I had already sprayed on there. I just got my heat gun out and passed it over lightly over the part that had gotten a little bit warped and just slowly moved it back into place. The next thing that I did was I put on a layer of Montana Gold Silver Chrome paint over that, and I did not put that outside. Now it is time for us to return to the hilt in order to get that all painted up. If you watched my tutorial on Sylvie's crown, then you will have known that I used a mixture of Vallejo miniature paints in order to get that kind of hammered gold look that was going on. I used Vallejo's polished gold to stipple all over the hilt and give it a nice even coat. Once that coat was dry, I went in with some bronze colors and stippled that all over as well. I didn't try and make that a cohesive layer, that was more so a mid-tone layer. And once that was cured, I went back over with some polished gold just to make it all evened out. And as you can tell here, it looks more realistic to have kind of the mid-tones, and there's just a little bit something extra in there than just straight polished gold. As for all of those silver accents, I just used a Vallejo color in silver as well to paint all of those in with a little paintbrush. Once all of that paint was dry, I then took out some naphtha and oil paints and created an oil wash and just painted that all over the hilt to get it all into like the grimy, gritty parts of it. And I used a paper towel to dab away at it so I could kind of control where all of the mess was. And I let that hilt dry for about 1 to 2 days just because oil paints are a little bit finicky, and I gave that a nice matte clear coat just to seal everything in so it doesn't get all over my hands, because it totally did whenever I was doing some TikToks and I was mad at myself for not sealing it before I did that. Now that the hilt is done, it is time to go back to the blade, and for the blade I really wanted to do something different here. I remember seeing in one of the episodes that the blade that Sylvie had was kind of hitting the light just right, that it looked blue, and I kind of did a double take because I was like, oh, that looks really cool. I really like the way that that looked. So to accomplish that, I just took some of my husband's inks and an airbrush, and I just lightly created a gradient all along the sword. The inks are really a nice mix of being transparent enough that they'll let the chrome show through, and it just ended up giving it a really neat effect whenever I was done with it. The one thing to keep in mind whenever you're working with inks is that you really have to work slowly with them. You can't just squirt out a thick layer of the stuff because it won't look right. It'll kind of pull in all of the wrong places. So you have to be very patient and do very light passes of it, kind of building up over it over time. But once you get the hang of it, it actually ends up giving a really cool effect to this blade, and I am so happy that I did it. And yes, it glows blue because orcs are nearby. This last step is totally optional, and honestly so is the blue part that I just talked about, but I decided that I wanted to go into all of the details on the sword and just kind of paint them black with a little paintbrush. You can paint them any color you want, honestly. I just black was what I decided to do. The last thing I did with the blade before I glued everything together was I gave it a glossy clear coat. Now, the thing is that if you use a gloss clear coat, it is going to mute and dull that chrome finish. However, it had already kind of dulled the finish whenever I was using the inks over top of it, so I really didn't mind. And the thing is that those inks, they're kind of fragile, or at least they were fragile from being on top of the paint that I was using. I was already seeing some of the ink chipping, so I really wanted to make sure I could protect it, so I just sprayed on some gloss clear coat. I would rather preserve my paint job than worry about a little bit of dullness with the chrome. All that's left to do now is to glue that blade into the hilt of the sword, and to do that, I'm just using my trusty old 5-minute epoxy from Gorilla Glue. I let that cure for about a half an hour, and then it is time to cause some chaos and to cause a lot of problems for a lot of people, specifically named Doctor Strange, to fix in a movie that's coming soon. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you are going to be making one of these swords, then definitely let me know down below. If you're going to be making a Sylvie, let me know down below, and if you're going to be at Dragon Con, let me know down below, because I am still trying to figure out my Dragon Con lineup. I need to really nail it down. Appreciate you guys so much for watching my videos, and as always, I will catch you guys next time. Bye! I have no idea if any of that was good. Like, I have no idea, that was such a train wreck.